Well, I think we should start, otherwise we will have difficulties to increase our welfare significantly during the next hour. The subject is the foundations of welfare economics, and the problem that we are dealing here with is the justification of economic policies. So, in how far does economic science help us to justify economic policy making? Now, if you think of it the way Ludwig von Mises has often presented economic science, namely as a value-free discipline, we are having to do here with a body of positive propositions, that is, of propositions that describe the world as it is, not as it should be. So we have the famous word of Wertfreiheit, wertfrei, or value-free, propositions, which is a term that had been coined by Max Weber. That is the gentleman that you have already seen on Sunday. He was some 10 years older than Mises. Mises admired him very much. Weber was one of the young revolutionaries within the historical school of economics, and Mises followed in a way in his footpath, recognizing that the social sciences cannot do without theory. It's not just a matter of fact gathering and empirical field studies, but we need also to use theory both to interpret human behavior and to make policy decisions. And, Mises went far beyond Weber, who died soon, I believe in 1920. Weber, in fact, has taken up a distinction that goes back even further in that to the Scottish philosopher David Hume, who emphasized the so-called is-ought dichotomy. So according to Hume, there is no bridge between an is and an ought. Right? We have is propositions such as there is this object here, or that is this object, or there is this table. Here we have a whiteboard. So it's a is statement. And then there are ought statements. That is something like, you ought to listen to me, right? Or you ought to look at the whiteboard, or things like this. Now Hume's point was that there is no bridge that leads from the is proposition to the ought statement, or to the ought proposition. That is, what we do in science is to describe the world as it is. Science is inherently a body of is propositions, but it doesn't necessarily help us in making political decisions. Right? It does not have any implications for what is practically all important, namely ought propositions. And Max Weber has a very similar view. Right? So he says, well, as soon as we use the word ought or should or have to or something like this, we are jumping, in fact, from is to ought. Right? All that we do then is we are no longer scientists. We just enunciate our personal value judgments. Right? But science should not be impregnated with value judgments. It should be value-free, wertfrei. Right? And this Weberian campaign was directed against his forebears from the historical school, right, who committed both sins. So not only they disregarded theory and just looked at the facts that could be gathered with the senses, but then from this they jumped all the time to political conclusions. I remember the example that I've given to you on Sunday. That was one of the critics said, well, he described what the actual practice, what the practice of the historical school boiled down to, or their methodology, you might say. The methodology consisted in gathering facts and then jumping to policy conclusions. So they went into the apartments of the workers, right, measured them, said, that's 200 square feet. Oh, that's too small. Right? So the state should do something about this. Right? And then Weber said, well, that doesn't follow. It does not follow from, well, okay, so it's the size of the apartment. Now, how we evaluate this is a completely different question. Well, by which standard is it too small? Is there any absolute standard that we say? And then we say, okay, we count apartments that have 200 square feet and less as small, and everything else is then higher. Okay, that's one thing. But how do we arrive at the proposition the state should do something about it? Right? Where do we pull this out of which shirt do we pull this trump? Right? And Weber said, well, there's nothing, it's not in the fact itself that the apartment has 200 square feet that it follows from it that the state has to do anything about it. Right? And as we shall see, Mises refined this critique considerably by pointing out that with a classical economist, that it is still a completely different question whether the state can change this. Right? Often interventionists have a very simple view or simplistic view of reality. They see rich people on the one hand and poor people on the other hand, and see, oh well, it's all a matter of distributing wealth a little bit more equitably. Right? The point that Mises constantly raised was, well, I mean, there are very, very few rich people in the world. Taking away riches from them will not significantly improve the living conditions of the masses. Right? If you think, well, how many people have rich villa or big villas in the world? Well, not very many. Most of them live in the United States or in Western Europe. And then we see how, in which conditions do, let's say, 2 billion Chinese people live. Well, on much smaller scale. Would it help much if we took villas away from, let's say, 1 million Americans and then distributed them among 2 billion Chinese? Well, it would not change much. It would not change much. And probably then it would also destroy the incentives that all these other people have for producing villas and other goods. Okay, but so that's the kind of problem that we will talk about today. And let me illustrate this contention that there is no bridge from ought to is by a few examples. So all the examples that I will give, their purpose is to illustrate the fact that economic science is a science of positive propositions, that is propositions. They describe facts of social reality, but that they can be used for completely different purposes. They can be used in the light of policy views that are close to the mindset of an Austro-libertarian. They can also be used from the point of view of an interventionist. Consider, for example, the analysis of social security schemes, for example, public pension funds and so on. Here, the analysis that we apply to all other coercive or monopoly schemes applies, namely that they tend to be less profitable than similar ventures that are exposed to the competition of the free market. As a consequence, public pension fund schemes and so on typically have a lower rentability, lower profitability than other forms of investment. That is, if you are forced into a public pension scheme, the typical result is that you get a return on your investment that is much lower than what you could have got on the free market. Right? Now, does it follow that therefore it's clear to everybody, we should do without public pension funds? No, not necessarily. Right? Take, for example, the reforms that the German Chancellor Bismarck, his reforms that he instituted in the 1880s, he instituted public health insurance and public old age insurance and so on. Did Bismarck ignore economic law? Did he not know that the return on all this money that was poured into the scheme would be lower than otherwise? No, he did not at all ignore this, but he didn't care, because his purpose was a completely different one. His purpose was to make the working classes dependent on the German government, to loyalize them to the state. Right? So he did not at all contest the fact that the economist pointed out. He did not contest economic law, only his purpose was a completely different one. Take another example. I'm putting again my neoclassical hat, right, to demand and supply. This really, I don't quite believe in it, but we will serve my my illustration. So we have a labor market here, right? So we have here supply and demand. And now let's say we institute minimum wage laws that are impose prices above the equilibrium rate, that is, above the market rate. Let's say the government introduces this wage, which will mean that workers supply this amount of money, this amount of work, but employers, capitalists, only demand this amount of work, and as a consequence, we have this here, what is this? Unemployment. So we get unemployment. Now, that's an is proposition, right? Establishing or coercing on the market a minimum wage that is higher than the one that would have obtained on the market brings about unemployment. Now, does it follow that somehow human beings are propelled from this is statement that it is clear for everybody that they ought not to institute minimum wages that are higher than the market rate? Well, obviously not. So the question is, are our politicians who do such things, are they ignorant of economic law? So that's one possibility, and in some cases it might apply. But actually, that here is not very difficult to understand. So I don't believe if they are smart enough to sit in an office in Washington, D.C., that I cannot believe that they cannot at the same time understand this. So I believe that actually most of them do understand this. So what might then be the reason why they still institute minimum wage laws? Yeah, there are politicians who count on something like a proletarization effect or immiseration effect. They want to create a proletariat that is dependent on the handouts, unemployment benefits and doles and so on coming from the state. Same thing as Bismarck. Right? So the question is, for example, Jesse Jackson, is he stupid or is he evil? Right? If he calls for minimum wage laws, well, who will be concerned? Ask yourself, who will be concerned most? Whose value productivity is lowest? Right? Well, lowest value productivity is old people, right? And then we have young people, right? And we have also black people. Of course, not all. You were just talking about the Gauss curve, right? So the average black value productivity is lower than white value productivity. So if you institute minimum wage laws, who will be mostly concerned? Well, blacks. Right? And then you have the great leader of the black liberation movement popping up on the screen. Say, suppression and, right, they hate the blacks, are racist, capitalists, and so on, right? And then again you have the black liberation agenda that serves the person that we just talked about, and anti-capitalism joined, right? So again, it's not necessarily the case that there is any dispute about the economic law. You might very well agree on the economic law, but your policy conclusions, right, the agenda that follows, the art that follows for you personally from it can be completely different in one case than in another case. For the same reason, why do labor unions typically press for minimum wage laws? Well, because, there's a fourth group that I didn't mention, immigrants. Especially from third world countries, right? They tend to have lower value productivity, of course. Germans tend to have higher value productivity. But, I mean, especially from third world countries, well, these people typically, they go for lower paid jobs. Their value productivity of their labor is lower. So what happens if we have minimum wage laws? Well, it keeps these here and these here off the labor market. Right? Keeps young people off the labor market. Keeps immigrants off the labor market. Why do labor unions support continuous extension of schooling, right? Longer school years, and then why does the American Medical Association, why do they and their homologues in Europe, in all countries of Europe, why do they tend to believe that, well, in any case, you need to extend schooling and training for future doctors? Well, for the same reason, it keeps these guys off the labor market. And so tends to increase wages, their wages, above the level they would otherwise have obtained. Again, there's no disagreement then on the is, right, on the economic analysis, but the policy conclusion seems to be, is different for one group or certain individuals, completely different than in the case of other individuals. So, here's then our problem. How can we arrive at a scientific underpinning of economic policy? Are we stuck with the is statements, or more precisely, do is statements or does science put us only in a position to say, well, this is how social relationships work, and then we as social scientists, economists, praxeologists are not much more than technicians that deliver ammunition for completely different purposes, right? Libertarians can use it, but the statists can use it too. Or can we go beyond this? The central problem for us in a scientific treatment of this question is to define or is to identify a standard of better and worse. What is it that allows us to classify objectively, scientifically, certain phenomena, a certain state of affairs as better than other states of affairs which are worse? And here we have, first of all, the classical schools, or classical economists. I have in mind in particular the Scottish school, Adam Smith, or the British school, we should say, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, the Mills, and others. So what is their central notion? How did they try to formulate this problem? Well, the central concept here in this context was wealth, the concept of wealth. And in their arguments for libertarian policies, and the justification of libertarian policies, they would typically argue, well, this policy increases wealth, right? Therefore, it should be pursued. It is better than other policies which do not increase wealth or do not increase as much. The problem with the classical approach was that the notion of wealth, or what was meant with wealth, was a very materialistic phenomenon. Right? So what they meant is a higher endowment with commodities, consumer goods in particular. Right? Or fruit and cars and streets and houses, these things. So that's wealth. Now what's the problem with this? The problem is quite apparently that these things, at least at some point, might not be decisive for at least certain members of society. Right? You might very well object to a classical economist who says, well, look, I mean, we need to save more, and right, the government should tax away, let's say, 50% of the income of everybody, and then put this at the disposition of the capitalists so that we promote economic growth. What could be the objection to it? Well, the objection could be, well, we don't care that much about more material growth. Right? We want to spend more time with our children, with the family, right? Sing songs to our wives, and dance with the daughters, look at the sun, listen to the birds. Right? Why should we go into the factories and go on working and so on? So, what has a classical economist object to this? What can he object against this argument? I think he cannot object much against this. Right? It is not, if it were inherently so that wealth was preferable, more wealth was at all times, at all places, under any circumstances, right? An additional delta wealth is always preferable. Well, then this position would follow, but this is not the case. Right? individuals at some point do not prefer more wealth, they prefer other goods that do not have material clothing. So that's the fundamental problem in classical welfare theory, if you want to call it this. The classical economists didn't call it welfare theory. You have a very good discussion of this attitude of the British school in Murray Rothbard's History of Economic Science, the volume dealing with classical economics, in particular with Adam Smith. So Rothbard argues, Smith generalizes his Puritan ethics, right? So you don't care about all these things, just like looking at birds and all these things. Idleness is very bad and evil, sinful. Right? So the thing to do is to work and produce material things all the time. That's not an argument that is genuine with Rothbard. Many other critics of Smith have also advanced it, but there's a good discussion in Rothbard's book. Now, what then after the classical economists? How has this how is this problem dealt with? Well, after the marginalist revolution, about which you have heard at the beginning of the week, so we are speaking roughly about the year 1870, economic science is put on a completely different basis. Right? Before, the explanation of market prices and other market phenomena always explained these phenomena in terms of cost, that is, in terms of other materialistic phenomena. The marginalists took the exact opposite approach. They explained all market phenomena in terms of value. Right? So not cost any longer, and not material constraints, so to say, but value, something coming from the acting individual. So this had a repercussion also on welfare economics, on the way economists dealt with the problem we are here talking about. And so all modern solutions to this problem are built on value theory. Now, Austrians, as Mengarians, say value theory. In neoclassical economics, it's called utility theory. And so the idea is, as we have also seen at the beginning of the week, you have decreasing marginal utility as a function of the increasing quantity of a good that you have for each individual. And that marginal utility puts us, because every single good has marginal utility. I hope you left more space for your notes. Okay, right. So then you have, let's say, something like here, and here we have it here. And so the point is, what each individual does is to equalize marginal utility for each good, for all goods, right? For all goods, the marginal utility must be the same, and it follows from this that you have different optimal quantities for each good. Okay, so of this good we would have very much, this good not very much, and of this good some intermediate quantity, depending on the position of the utility curve. Alright, so marginal utility theory therefore gave us a new approach, a new way of formulating this problem. And now the solution was, we have to, with our political decision making, bring about a situation in which this comes into being, that is, in which the marginal utilities of all goods in the economy are equal. That's the optimal situation, optimal state of affairs. The problem is several problems. First problem is these three graphs refer to one individual, three different commodities of one individual. How can we... but the problem that we have in politics is, of course, to make decisions concerning many individuals, right, that have an impact of many individuals. So how can we get this together? Can we somehow compose this? Is it legitimate to somehow accumulate these graphs? All right, so we have different individuals here. Let's say that is individual you poor chaps, I mean, you don't know that you are here with the hair of Picasso. Or somebody else, so we'll go on. Right, so you have here the next individual, and then here another one. Right, and you have different so and so. Right, for all the different goods. So the question is, can we somehow draw a bottom line, right, and say here's the great summation, and draw up utility, social utility functions for each of these goods, or maybe for all goods together, one big social utility function. Right? And you see already, well, that seems to be rather problematic. Right? For what is utility? Can we observe utility? Can we, listen to it, smell it? Has anybody ever seen a util crawling over the desk? No? So it's, right, we have the usual problem in neoclassical economics that it's largely built on fiction. And we cannot tell, well, so we have already a problem as far as the pure units are concerned. But there's a more fundamental problem relating to the way neoclassical theory conceives of the function and conceives of utility at all. So as I've said here, it's a quantitative conception of utility. Utility, and here you have the quantity. Right, so the point is that this quantitative relationship is the causal factor of the demand curve on the market. Right? And it is the causal factor because it is conceived to be something different. This utility in the neoclassical framework is a psychic phenomenon. Right? It's our feeling of satisfaction that goes in hand with the consumption of goods. And so this factor is then conceived to be the cause, or at least one of the most important causes, of the demand curve that determines our behavior or reflects our behavior on the market. Right? Now the problem is that this psychologism, which some authors still today, I've just noticed, believe to be the characteristic feature of the Austrian School, or the great contribution of the Austrian School, is not at all Austrian. Right? That is the economist who is most responsible for this is William Stanley Jevons, right? Who has had a huge impact on Ludwig von Mises. That's the way he conceived of the way we explain prices. Right? We have a psychological fact on the one hand, satisfaction, and that decreases with increasing consumption, and we have another fact, demand curve, that shapes prices, and these the first is the cause of the second. Now the problem is in fact that this it is easy to refute this on empirical grounds in many cases. It is not always the case, or first of all on purely empirical grounds, it is not always the case that our behavior is determined by feelings of satisfaction that we prove in from the consumption of things. Often our behavior is determined not by the satisfaction, psychological satisfaction that we get from the action, but by ethical considerations, for example. Right? Why do men tend to get married or have stable relationships with girlfriends and so on, rather than going to the hookah all the time? Right? One of the reasons is, apart from prices and so on. But I can tell you that's not the most important reason. I thought when I entered marriage, right, it would be a great deal and everything is so much cheaper, division of labor. It's not true. It's not true. Right? So the decisive consideration is an ethical one. Right? I mean, it's not, human beings are not brutes, animals, determined just by any psychological stimuli they might get and then running after it like rabbits. Right? There are other considerations that come into play. Now, Mises still upheld that, well, ultimately it's satisfaction that determines our behavior, so he was a eudaemonist, but Mises had a completely different conception of this. Right? Mises had a purely formal way of conceiving of what it means to be satisfied. It means to prefer one thing over another. Right? So he used the word satisfaction in a different sense than the psychologists like Jevons. And here then is indeed the great difference between the Austrian theory of value and the neoclassical theory of utility. In the Austrian theory of value, you have a triangular relationship. You have one acting person, and you have alternative actions. Right? And value is this tripart relationship between an acting person and the alternatives that he faces at any point of time. At any point of time, right, you are confronted with a certain set of alternatives. You, for example, you can choose to stay on in this lecture and listen, or you can just go out or you might listen, or think about how nice it will be when you're back home, or when the coffee machine is running well. Right? But in any case, what value means is this relationship of one action, let's say A, being preferred over another action B by this individual in question. Right? That is value. Value is a relationship that is inherent in an action. Right? So let me draw another diagram to illustrate this. Let's say we have this is a human action, and this here is the observed part of it, or the observable part of it, behavior, and the whole thing is action. Right? Human action. Right? Some part of the action we do observe. Maybe what we do, you sit in this room, that's observable. We cannot observe the alternatives that you could have also chosen, right? Going out and so on. So we have here alternatives that remain counterfactual because you didn't choose them. The point is that all elements in Austrian value theory are part of one action. Right? Whereas here you have two different phenomena. You have the psychology of the actor on the one hand, then its action on the other hand. You say, well, there's a causal relationship between one thing and the other thing. Here it's really only one thing that we are talking about. And value consists in a relationship between these different parts of the one thing. Okay? So, and in the Austrian theory of value, well, so I've seen that Rothbard, he also sets up graphs, and, well, I'm not quite happy with this, but in any case. So the point would be, in the Austrian approach, we wouldn't set up a utility curve and say, well, so this determines, or is the causal factor determining the price curve. Rather, we would say, well, this price curve, as it comes to be established on the market, is the result of human beings valuing things. Right? And what they do is to value each quantity with a higher in a higher stock lower than the unity of the same good in a lower stock. Right? It's part of one action. Okay, but Austrians have never come up with a welfare theory based on value theory, for a good reason, because there is no common unit between the different values, right? Here we have value of one acting person. If the person goes through time, right, 1 hour later, even a couple of seconds later, the alternatives might be different. So where's the common denominator to compare these different values? Well, there is none, because it changes constantly. Right? So you cannot accumulate value even for one person and still less can you accumulate it for different persons. And that is the reason why Austrians have never, even believed that it would be possible to come up with a welfare theory based on the theory of value. Neoclassicals did. Let me very briefly mention that the same problem also obtains in the Coasian approach. Coase, a famous economist of the Chicago School, who said, well, we've got to choose that option, that political option that minimizes transaction costs. Because the problem that we here have is, there are several problems involved. I will just mention two of them. One is that Coase confuses transactions with transaction costs. Right? It's not that we, because we need to make transactions to attain certain ends, we always do this, that these transactions are necessarily costly. Right? What is costly for one person might be desirable for another person. Right? One of my favorite examples is bargaining in the US compared to bargaining in an Arab zouk. Right? If you go to the US and then you start negotiating with the seller of your washing machine or something, right, he kicks you out. If you go to the zouk and you do not negotiate, he gets angry at you. If you just say, he says, oh, what do you want for the pen? He says, okay, whatever, 10 dinars or so, and you hand him over 10 dinars. What? He wants to go on and have transactions. No transaction costs. Right? So you see the point. The assumption of Coase is that all transactions are inherently costly. That is not necessarily the case. People actually often like the things that they are doing. It is true that for some men, if they go to a ball with their girlfriends or wives and so on, while dancing is a transaction, because it's not cherished for themselves, right? They just want to make the wife happy and so on. Then they go dancing. It's transaction costs, right? But for those who like dancing, it's a transaction, but not transaction cost. It's transaction benefit. Right? Yeah. Then the second problem is a fundamental problem in Coase, is that he cannot take account of values, of individual values. Right? His theory makes most sense in a purely commercial setting, when you have two companies buying and selling, buying factors production on the market, selling products on the market, then you can, with some, just not perfect, with some plausibility, argue that it makes sense to give the resource to the one company that can make the best use of it, because it sells it at the product at the highest price, or more precisely, the disputed factor will end up with this company anyway. In all other contexts, if you're out of a commercial setting, that is, for example, if you have one factory, right, and that emits smoke and other noise and other nuisance, and you have consumers around, just people living there who don't sell their houses or don't do anything with it, it's impossible to apply the Coasian solution to this. Okay, but I must leave it there because I still have to tell you certain other things. So, the theory of value doesn't seem to be a guarantee for it. At least the least thing we can say, it's a very problematic approach to come up with a theory of welfare. The one economist that has probably come closest to the solution preferred by the Austrians is Vilfredo Pareto. That's an Italian economist, sociologist, living and writing at the turn of the 19th or 20th century and into the 1920s, in fact. Was an admirer and pupil of Léon Walras. And so a member of the Lausanne School, a Walrasian, but he was a great man, a great mind, and I can only recommend to all of you to read his Manual of Political Economy. It's still worth reading, so there are certain limitations. We are not happy with all of it from an Austrian point of view, but he's certainly a spirited writer. And so we have, Pareto gave us the so-called Pareto Criterion. Of course, he didn't call it that way. Others called it after him. But he explained it also in this book that I just mentioned, Manual of Political Economy. So, according to the Pareto Criterion, a state of affairs is optimal if we cannot improve, a social state of affairs is optimal if we cannot improve the member of any member of the state of affairs of any member of society, of any individual member of society, without deteriorating the state of affairs of another member of society. Okay, that's the criterion, and of course it's squarely based on neoclassical utility theory. Right? So the utilities, it's possible to compare the utilities of different persons. Right? So he jumps over the problem of the dimension and so on. But that's his idea. And the problem with it is precisely that first of all, he needs to rely on interpersonal comparisons of utility, which are based on a fiction. Right? As we don't know anything about utility, never observe it, and so on. And then it's also not clear, well, what would this mean in practice? Well, what are the kinds of things that we need to take account of? Consider in particular the following case. If you have a person that is, so you have a state of affairs, present state of affairs, present distribution of resources, and now let's say we agree to, you don't look at me, we agree to exchange something. You give me your manuscript, your precious notes, and I give you this pen, which I don't even own, but it doesn't matter. So, and right, and then somebody else could say, you for example, you could say, no, this puts me in a worse position, right? Because I don't like it that he has the pen and that you have the manuscript. It should be as it is. Now, what would we have to say, or what could a Parisian or neoclassical economist object to this? And all that he has at his disposal are the utility curves of the different individuals, right? But he doesn't tell us how these utility curves come into being. Right? It could indeed be that you have a very envious person here, and he just abhors the fact that other people could get richer than he himself, or than the average of society. Or you could have an extreme conservative, a nutty conservative who just wants to have everything as it is, no change. You should move. You shouldn't move. Right? You stay there, because otherwise you would disrupt the optimum of our nutty conservative. What would happen in this case? Well, how can Pareto deal with such cases? Well, he cannot deal with them at all. Right? He would have to say, okay, if this change, any exchange that goes on, puts other persons in a worse position, considering their utility curves, it shouldn't take place. Right? Would put us in a suboptimal position. So the Pareto criterion therefore ends up, for all practical purposes, in a justification of the status quo, right? Because that's the political status quo in particular, which cannot be really justified with the Pareto criterion either, but so as low changes as possible, because there's always the possibility of objection from envious persons and persons who just like the maintenance of things in their present state. Now, Murray Rothbard, in 1956, in an article with the title "A Reconstruction of Welfare and Utility Economics," amended the Pareto criterion in the following way. You will remember, so Austrian value theory is this three-part thing. You have the person, and the person is confronted with alternatives. Now, the alternatives are always different uses of his property. Right? That's what the alternatives are. And here then is the great paradigm shift that comes in with the article of Rothbard, that Rothbard says, well, we cannot dissociate value, that is the thing that explains market prices, from the context given through property, through private property. So property enters the picture. Okay? And now Rothbard says, all this here is all nonsense, utility detached from people using their property. All that counts is use of private property. And now it follows immediately from this that when two persons make an exchange on the market, each of them is in a better position, right, measured in terms of value, than he would otherwise have been, or than he would have been if he had not performed this exchange, because he prefers to do the exchange rather than not performing it. Okay? And because only uses of private property count in this scenario, the objection coming from envious persons or nutty conservatives, right, or extreme conservatives, don't count. Right? So Rothbard would say, well, that doesn't count as value. Only use of your own property counts as value. Right? So only what you do with your property, and by the fact that you do it, demonstrates that your value has increased, so that your welfare has increased. Right? That's the famous principle of demonstrated preference that is linked up with use of one's property, one's private property. Okay, so what's the problem in Rothbard's approach? Well, the problem in Rothbard's approach is that he doesn't justify a starting point. Everything is good and fine as far as it goes, right? But still, I mean, how do we handle objections from these people? They would say, I mean, come on. After all, the point is you want to give a scientific explanation of why one policy is better than another. And then you say, well, if we just look at how people use their own property, right, all market exchanges bring about improvements. We admit this, right, says the envious person, but we don't accept your starting point. Why should we respect only this criterion, that or should take into account only what people do with their own property? Right? Why should my concerns as an envious person not be at least as important, right, as what the others do with their property? Right? I think that I have the right that nothing changes, or at least that you don't become very rich, right? And that be it. So, in other words, the problem of Rothbard's approach is that he doesn't justify his starting point, and the solution to this problem we have at present in a theory developed by Hans Hermann Hoppe, which some have called Argumentation Ethics. I will first briefly present the argument and then say something about its alleged ethical character. So what Hoppe says is any deliberation about public policy can take place only in a discussion. Right? So we need to use discursive reasoning, but we also need to use arguments in favor of propositions that we prefer. That applies both to Rothbard and to Pareto, as well as to the envious person or to the extreme conservatives. They all have to use arguments to defend their positions. Now, what is an argument? Hoppe says, well, an argument is an appeal to somebody else to use his property in a certain way, right? And it is based on the assumption that the other person, the discussion partner himself, recognizes my own property in my speaking organs and so on. Right? If I make an argument to you, and I'm now making arguments, right, the purpose is that you change your mind, or reinforce your opinions that you had anyway or whatever. Right? In any case, you use your property in a certain way, and so I recognize that you are the owners of your brain, so to say, and appeal to you to use your thinking in a certain way. Now, what that means is that any discussion presupposes from the outset a mutual recognition of self-ownership. Right? Any discussion presupposes mutual recognition of self-ownership. And once we have justified the starting point, we can justify all other acquisitions of tangible property that comes through the use of one's property in oneself, so homesteading and exchange and production and so on. On the other hand, violations of property cannot be justified because they involve a performative contradiction. Right? I cannot say and argue, well, you are not the owner of yourself as an argument because, you are not the owner of yourself because, it would be nonsense. Right? Because I thereby recognize that you are the owner of yourself, otherwise it would make no sense to argue at you in the first place. If I were your owner, well, then I would just change change my thinking, and your thinking would be changed immediately because I was your owner. Right? So, violations of property rights cannot be argued through without contradiction. So from the Hoppian case for the free market then, for a free society, is that only respect of private property can be defended without contradiction, whereas violations of property rights cannot be defended without contradiction. Those who argue for such violations contradict themselves. Right? So what we have here is a very interesting case. It is not really ethics, because Hoppe doesn't say anything about what we should do. Right? And ethics is a system of ought propositions, of should propositions. Right? But that's not what Hoppe does. So Hoppe tells us, well, he gives us a praxeology of justification processes. That's what it is. So it's a body of is propositions, right? But that have a political implication. Right? Why is argument so important? Well, I said initially because all political deliberation takes place in arguments. Well, but what does this mean? Practically, it means, well, any form of organization, right, of human group action, which, as we know, is more physically productive than individual action, right, both as far as defense services are concerned and any other things, well, they are based on discussion and on argument. Right? Those who cannot argue through their propositions without contradiction are in a weaker position, right, than those who can do this, defend their propositions without contradiction. Okay, thank you.